In 1960, Great Britain did not just have a lead in the computing race, it had already won it. While the world looked toward the United States for the future was actually being built in Manchester, in the tea shops of London, and in the workshops of Ferranti. Britain possessed the first stored program computer, the first commercial business computer, and the most powerful supercomputer on the planet. But within a decade, that entire industry was dismantled, merged into a government-mandated ghost of its former self, or effectively abandoned. This is not merely a story of machines being sold as scrap due to a lack of faith. It is a story of a nation that possessed the fire of Prometheus and chose to let it go cold through strategic paralysis and a failure to understand the rhythm of a new global market. The popular notion that the UK simply gave up is an interpretation that hides a much more complex economic tragedy. If you want your content to perform better, you need to learn how to tell better stories. And the story of the British computer is a masterclass in context and conflict. If you think the Silicon Valley story started in California, you have been looking through the wrong lens. To understand why Britain failed in 1960, we must look back at why they succeeded in 1945. During the Second World War, Bletchley Park was the global epicenter of information technology, and the Colossus was its crowning achievement. Therefore, at the end of the war, Britain possessed a generation of engineers who understood vacuum tubes and logic gates better than anyone else on Earth. But there was a conflict that would haunt the industry for decades: the Official Secrets Act. Because the work at Bletchley was classified, the engineers who built the future were not allowed to talk about it. Therefore, while American scientists like ENIAC's creators were becoming celebrities and securing massive private funding, British pioneers were returning to universities to start from scratch in near obscurity. This forced the British computing scene into a fragmented, artisanal culture where every breakthrough was a local victory but a global secret. In 1948, at the University of Manchester, Freddie Williams and Tom Kilburn built a small-scale experimental machine. Known as the Baby, it was the first machine to ever execute a program stored in its own memory. It was small and crude, but it was the spark. Therefore, the government commissioned Ferranti to turn it into a commercial product, resulting in the Ferranti Mark I in 1951, the world's first commercially available general-purpose computer. But here is the conflict that a boring and then style of history misses. The British government viewed these machines as purely scientific instruments rather than the backbone of a new global economy. They saw a tool for calculating missile trajectories or nuclear physics, not a tool for running the entire world's business infrastructure. Therefore, while the technical lead was absolute, the strategic vision remained anchored in the pre-digital era. While the universities were pushing the limits of science, an unlikely player entered the field from the private sector, J. Lyons & Co. They were a catering empire, famous for tea shops and Swiss rolls. They did not want to calculate physics. They wanted to calculate the cost of 1,000 loaves of bread and manage the logistics of a massive supply chain. Therefore, they did something radical. They built their own computer. In 1951, the Lyons Electronic Office became the first computer in the world to run a routine office task. It managed payroll and inventory with a level of efficiency that was a decade ahead of its time. But the British manufacturing sector looked at Leo and saw a curiosity from a food company, not a technological revolution. Lyons was a catering firm, not a tech giant. Therefore, they struggled to find the partners needed to mass-produce the machine. This is a recurring rhythm in British history, a short sentence of brilliance followed by a long sentence of missed opportunities. By the mid-1950s, Britain had Ferranti for high-end science, English Electric for military applications, and LEO for business. It was a fragmented landscape, and therefore, the industry lacked the gravity needed to resist the coming storm from across the Atlantic. Across the ocean, a company called IBM was watching. They were not just building computers. They were building a religion of business efficiency. IBM's story lens was fundamentally different. They understood that a computer was not just a box of wires, it was a service. They did not just sell you a machine. They leased it to you, they trained your staff, and they promised that your business would never be obsolete. But in Britain, the philosophy remained artisanal. Companies like Ferranti would build a custom, masterpiece machine for a specific client. Therefore, every machine was unique, which made them nearly impossible to scale or support globally. In 1959, IBM released the 1401. It was not technically superior to what the British were making in fact. Many British engineers considered it clunky, but IBM had the capital. Therefore, they could offer financing and leasing that British firms could not match. British companies expected customers to pay upfront for the privilege of owning a computer. IBM made it easy to say yes to a lease. Therefore, the market began to shift away from British hardware before the 1960s even truly began. The conflict was now visible. British engineering was fighting against American marketing and financial logistics. It was a dance between the old world artisan and the new world industrialist. And in 1960, the artisan was starting to lose his footing. If there is one machine that represents the tragic height of British computing, it is the Ferranti Atlas. Developed by Ferranti and the University of Manchester, Atlas was, upon its completion in 1962, the most powerful computer in the world. It was decades ahead of its time, introducing the concept of virtual memory or the one-level store. This allowed the computer to automatically manage its own memory hierarchy, a concept that is the foundation of every smartphone and laptop we use today. When it was turned on, it was estimated that Atlas alone provided half of the total computing power available in the entire United Kingdom. Therefore, you would expect the British government and industry to order hundreds of them to secure their lead, but they did not. Only a handful were ever built. The machine was too powerful, too expensive, and too intimidating for a government that still thought in terms of paper ledgers and civil service ranks. Therefore, Ferranti found itself in a crisis. They had invested millions into the most advanced technology on Earth, but they had no home market to sustain the production line. This is the moment where faith began to erode. It was not that they did not believe the machines worked. They did not believe they could sell them. By 1963, the British government realized they were losing a race they had initially won. Harold Wilson, the leader of the Labour Party, gave a famous speech promising a Britain forged in the white heat of a new technological revolution. The government wanted to save the industry, and therefore they decided to force everyone to work together. They created the Ministry of Technology. But the dance between the state and the private sector was clumsy. The government's solution to the IBM threat was consolidation via mergers. They forced Ferranti's computer department to merge with ICT in 1963. Then they forced English Electric, Leo, and Elliott Automation to merge. Finally, in 1968, they forced the entire industry into a single entity, ICL International Computers Limited. However, the 1968 merger triggered an internal architectural war that most historians overlook. On one side, you had the Leo legacy, a lineage of machines optimized for high-volume business data processing, emphasizing decimal arithmetic and character handling. On the other side, English Electric brought its KDF9 scientific powerhouse and its newer System 4, which was a clone of the RCA Spectra 70 and, by extension, the IBM System 360. Therefore, the engineers within the newly formed ICL were not working together. They were fighting for the survival of their respective instruction sets. The conflict was fundamental. Do you build a future based on the scientific precision of English Electric or the commercial logic of Leo? Because the architectures were so fundamentally different, software written for a Leo 3 could not run on an English Electric KDF-9. Therefore, ICL was forced to maintain multiple, competing production lines simultaneously, bleeding capital while IBM consolidated the world under a single, unified architecture. The struggle to bridge this gap led to the creation of the new range, later known as the ICL 2900 series. The goal was to build a machine that could emulate all the predecessor architectures. But the technical challenge of emulating the LEO's unique character-addressable memory and the KDF-9 stack-based scientific processing on a single hardware platform was a nightmare. Therefore, the development of the 2900 series was plagued by delays. ICL spent the late 60s and early 70s looking backward, trying to protect its existing customer base from the trauma of software migration, while IBM was looking forward, capturing new markets with the seamless compatibility of the System 360 family. This was the true cost of the merger. It didn't create a champion. It created a committee. This brings us to the core of the myth, the idea that Britain had no faith in its computers and therefore sold them as scrap. In 1960, machines like the Leo and the Ferranti Mark I were reaching the end of their operational lives. By the late 1960s, these first-generation machines were vacuum-tube dinosaurs in a transistor world. Therefore, when ICL took over, they had to clear the floor for the next generation. There was no sense of digital heritage at the time. These were not seen as monuments. They were seen as obsolete inventory. Therefore, many were dismantled to recover precious metals or simply to make room for new equipment. The term sold as scrap is an exaggeration of this practical obsolescence. Obsolete machines were dismantled or scrapped as technology advanced. But companies were merged or sold, such as Ferranti to ICT, in 1963 rather than abandoned out of a lack of belief. The real tragedy was not that the physical machines were scrapped. The tragedy was that the intellectual lead was scrapped. The engineers, who invented virtual memory and multi-programming, found themselves working for a company that was increasingly just a vassal, state to government contracts and aging hardware architectures. The faith that was lost was not in the computer itself. It was faith in Britain's ability to lead the world as a commercial superpower. The government stopped asking how do we beat IBM and started asking how do we survive IBM. Therefore, the industry shifted from innovation to protectionism. The UK had the hardware and they had the software, but they did not have the strategic investment or the scale to compete against the rapid expansion of American giants. ICL eventually faded, and the great names like Ferranti, Leo, and English Electric became footnotes in history. But look at the device you are using right now. Inside almost every smartphone in the world is a processor designed by ARM. ARM is a British company. It was born from the wreckage of this era, founded by people who refused to give up on the idea of a unique British architecture. Therefore, the fire did not completely go out. It just became smaller, more efficient, and harder to see. Great Britain in 1960 did not lose its future because it was foolish, or because it sold its machines to the scrap heap. It lost its future because it was afraid to be as bold as its own engineers. It had the hardware, and it had the software, but it did not have the rhythm of the modern world. Next time you hear about a new breakthrough in AI or quantum computing, ask yourself, is the leadership looking at this through the lens of a scientist or the lens of a leader? Because if you do not have faith in your own revolution, someone else will buy it, rename it, and sell it back to you. The technical depth of this era is best exemplified by the Ferranti Atlas one-level store architecture. To understand the magnitude of this innovation, one must realize that before Atlas, a programmer was a glorified bookkeeper of memory. You had to know exactly where every bit of data was located, whether it was in the fast, expensive core memory or the slow, magnetic drum storage. If your program was larger than the core memory, you had to manually write code to swap data in and out. It was a tedious, error-prone process that limited the complexity of software. Atlas changed everything by introducing hardware-based paging. The machine was divided into pages of 512 words. When the processor called for an address, a set of page address registers pars checked instantly to see if that page was in the core memory. If wasn't, the hardware triggered what we now call a page fault. The supervisor, the world's first true operating system, would then automatically find the page on the drum and move it to the core. This was a revolution in abstraction. It meant that, for the first time, a programmer could write code as if the machine had an infinite amount of fast memory. Therefore, the Atlas was not just a faster machine. It was a machine that allowed for a new level of software complexity. It introduced extra codes, which were software routines that handled complex mathematical functions, but appeared to the programmer as if they were built directly into the hardware. This created a level of abstraction that made programming significantly faster. But the very sophistication of the Atlas was its undoing in the 1960s market. It was a Rolls-Royce in a world that was starting to demand Fords. The government and the private sector looked at the massive price tag of an Atlas installation and hesitated. Only 3 original Atlas I machines were ever commissioned, one for Manchester University, one for the NERN's National Institute for Research in Nuclear Science at Harwell, and one for London University. Therefore, Ferranti could never achieve the economies of scale needed to lower the price. While Ferranti was perfecting the Atlas, the British government was paralyzed by indecision regarding the funding of the next generation of machines. The NRDC, National Research Development Corporation, tried to coordinate the sector, but the funding was spread too thin across to many small companies. Every company, Ferranti, Elliott, English Electric, Leo, was chasing a small piece of the same pie. Therefore, none of them could afford the massive R&D budgets that IBM was deploying in the United States. This fragmentation was the true killer of the British industry. Even when the government finally forced the mergers into ICL in 1968, it was too late. The technical lead had evaporated as IBM's System 360 became the global standard. The myth of no faith is often tied to the dismantling of these machines, but the reality is more about the physical footprint of the technology. A Ferranti Atlas required a massive, climate-controlled room and a team of specialized technicians just to keep it running. By the early 1970s, a transistor-based machine a fraction of its size could outperform it. Therefore, keeping an Atlas running was not an act of faith. It was an act of financial madness. The machines were scrapped because they were no longer tools. They had become obstacles to the next generation of computing. But when they were dismantled, they took with them the culture of artisanal innovation that had defined the first 2 decades of British computing. To truly appreciate the tragedy, one must look at the specific logic of the Atlas Supervisor's learning program. This was the world's first automated resource manager. It didn't just move pages of memory. It watched how the program behaved. It used a predictive algorithm to guess which pages of memory would be needed next, and which could be safely discarded back to the drum. It was a primitive form of artificial intelligence applied to system management. In a different world, this software lead would have made Britain the capital of the software revolution. But software was not yet recognized as a product in 1960. It was seen as a necessary burden of the hardware. Therefore, the British engineers gave away the logic for free while trying to sell the expensive iron. This failure of perception extended to the very top of the British establishment. The Treasury, which controlled the purse strings for university and research grants, viewed computing as a capital expense to be minimized, rather than a strategic investment to be maximized. Therefore, Whenever a British company proposed a bold new leap in architecture, they were met with a request to simplify, to reduce costs, and to make do. But in technology, making do is a death sentence. While the UK was trying to save thousands of pounds on individual projects, IBM was spending billions of dollars to capture the entire global future. The conflict was not between two sets of engineers. It was between two different philosophies of the future. One side saw the computer as a refined tool for the elite. The other saw it as the utility for the masses. The final consolidation into ICL in 1968 reflected a competitive decline that was already decades in the making. It was a rescue mission disguised as a strategic merger. The government attempted to create a national champion, but you cannot build a champion out of companies that have already been outmarketed and outfinanced for 10 years. The ICL 1900 series and the later 2900 series were valiant efforts to create a unified British architecture, but they were always fighting a defensive war against the blue giant of IBM. By the time the industry was sold off or merged into international conglomerates, the pioneering spirit of Bletchley and Manchester had been buried under layers of corporate bureaucracy and government caution. The machines may have been scrapped, but the story of why they were scrapped remains a vital warning for any nation that thinks its technological lead is permanent. Strategic vision must match technical brilliance, or the brilliance will simply be sold as scrap to the highest bidder. Next time you see an old unit of magnetic tape or a rack of vacuum tubes in a museum, don't just see a piece of junk. See the open loops of a story that wasn't finished. Britain had the context, and they had the characters, but they lost the dance between innovation and implementation. The machines are gone, but the code they inspired still runs the world. Therefore, the story of Britain's lost computers is not a funeral. It is a blueprint of what happens when a nation loses faith in its own ability to define the future. The hardware may have been crushed and the companies may have dissolved, but the ideas, the virtual memory, the multitasking, the business logic became the invisible foundation of the modern era. Consider the rhythm of this history. It begins with the frantic, brilliant pace of wartime survival. It transitions into a slow, melodic period of university research. It builds into a discordant, chaotic clash of small companies fighting for scraps. And it ends with a heavy, silence-inducing thud of a forced merger. But within that silence, a new rhythm was already starting to beat. In the small towns of England, a new generation of engineers who had grown up on the stories of Atlas and Leo were starting to build something else. They were building the microcomputer revolution. They were building the machines that would eventually lead to ARM. They learned the lesson that their predecessors had missed, that the hardware is the body, but the software is the soul. Therefore, the ultimate legacy of the 1960 collapse was not the end of British computing, but its rebirth into something more agile, more commercial, and more enduring. The fire was never extinguished. It was merely decentralized. The giant, power-hungry machines of the 60s were replaced by the lean, efficient designs of the 80s and 90s. The UK found its rhythm again, not by trying to out-IBM, but by finding a new story lens, the lens of efficiency and embedded systems. Therefore, when we look back at 1960, we shouldn't just mourn the machines that were scrapped. We should study the conflict between the artisanal and the industrial. We should understand that the failure was one of scale, not of soul. The story of British computing is a music that continues to play, even if the instruments have changed. Write with a combination of short, medium, and long sentences to create a sound that pleases the reader's ear. Don't just write words. Write music. And the music of British computing is a symphony of brilliant starts, tragic middles, and an ongoing, vibrant future that is still being written today. To further increase the technical depth, Consider the internal memory management logic of the English Electric KDF-9. The KDF-9 was a pioneer of stack-based architecture, a concept that significantly influenced modern languages like Java and the hardware design of Burroughs machines. While Ferranti's Atlas focused on the one-level store through paging, English Electric pursued the nested stack approach to handle subroutines and mathematical expressions. Therefore, when ICL was formed, the engineers were faced with the impossible task of reconciling Ferranti's memory paging with English Electric's stack logic. This was like trying to merge a maritime empire with a land-based kingdom. The languages of power were simply incompatible. Furthermore, the role of Elliott Automation in the 1968 merger is often minimized, yet they were the masters of miniaturization in the British scene. The 803 and 903 series machines were robust, transistorized, and widely used in industrial control and education. But because the government-mandated national champion model focused on competing with IBM's mainframe dominance, the agile, industrial success of Elliott was sacrificed to feed the ICL mainframe engine. Therefore, the UK didn't just lose its mainframe lead. It strangled its burgeoning industrial automation led in the process. This is the ultimate but, therefore, tragedy. Britain tried to build a giant to fight a giant. But in doing so, they crushed the small, flexible innovators who might have won a different war entirely. The final word on the scrap myth must address the Ferranti Orion. The Orion was supposed to be the commercial successor to the Mark I, featuring high-end multitasking capabilities. But the project was plagued by technical complexity and management shifting. Therefore, by the time it was ready, the market had moved to the IBM 1401. Many Orions were dismantled before they even reached their full potential. This wasn't a lack of faith. It was a lack of synchronization. The UK was playing a beautiful piece of music, but they were 2 bars behind the rest of the world. And in the high-stakes dance of the computer age, being out of sync is the same as being out of business.